You're tuned in to Getting to the Root of It, focusing on healing and letting go of the wounds of addiction and other unresolved traumas of the past. Your breakthrough begins with you. Are you ready to change your life? Stay tuned as your host, expert therapist, personal development coach, and spiritual cheerleader, Natashah Khan, inspires you to live the life you were destined to live.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Getting to the Root of It. Today's topic is going to be on codependency, a conversation that I tend to have quite on the regular with so many individuals and families in trying to understand codependency and the root of the issue. With codependency, it is an addiction, just like any other addiction. And I speak on it a lot because I think many times we are more focused on someone, when we hear addiction, we focus on just the drugs and the alcohol. When in reality, the drugs and alcohol is a symptom and a coping mechanism that we use to really cope with much greater issues. So there are, over the years, many different definitions behind codependency. There is a great book out there by Melody Beattie called Codependent No More that I think has given a really great breakdown in understanding codependency. So I would encourage you to, when you have a chance, to be able to read that, to have a greater understanding. But today I'm going to share with you my understanding of it, how I learned it, how I experienced it, and of course, what I needed to do in order to overcome my codependency. I learned through the years that I wasn't just in recovery from drugs and alcohol, but I needed to be in recovery from codependent relationships. So if we just break down the word codependent, co meaning mutual, and then dependency being dependent, it's a mutual dependency within the dynamic of a relationship between individuals. Someone can be codependent with their partners, their spouses. They can be codependent in relationship with their children. Many can be codependent with their boss, within the workplace. And so there are a lot of different characteristics that help define a codependent. And I extracted some of these from the Codependent No More book just to give us some guidelines and a baseline of what I'm going to be talking about today. Some of those characteristics are being a caretaker, having low self-worth, repressing our thoughts and feelings, having obsessive thinking, the need to control, being in denial about our problems and or issues, developing dependency issues, poor communication, which affects our ability to set healthy boundaries. So therefore we have weak boundaries. We lack trust in ourselves. We lack trust in others. We have a lot of anger. And most oftentimes we do have problems with sex / intimacy. So those are just some of the characteristics that define the codependent. Studies have shown, and prior to, or I should say, on the heels of Alcoholics Anonymous, women, the wives of those men that were getting sober, discovered through going into their Al-Anon meetings that they were codependents. It's this dependency we develop as a result of, I always bring it back to our primal needs not being met. Right. So as you guys heard me had shared in earlier episodes about addiction, it is due to emotional disconnection. And emotional disconnection occurs when primal needs are not met, right? Our primal needs are food, shelter, love, affection, guidance, being nurtured, feeling safe, feeling protected, not just in the emotional sense, but also the physical sense. So what causes us to become codependents? Because we're not born codependent. People, places, and things, life experiences have a significant influence in what leads to us becoming dependent upon each other. And what we fail to realize is that in early development and in early childhood, that dependency on our caretakers is something that we yearn. It's something that we learn growing up, right? But oftentimes due to trauma, and I'll explain that in just a second, but due to trauma in our lives, we then are stunted in the way that we develop mentally and emotionally. And as a result, we never seem to grow out of or grow beyond the dependency of someone. What happens is if we find ourselves in a place where we can't depend on anyone, and we have that low self-esteem or that lack of trust in ourselves, this is where that codependency can then manifest into other dependency issues, leading to your drugs and alcohol, leading to being a workaholic, and or having eating disorder issues, food issues, right? Overeating, undereating. It can lead to mental health issues of depression and anxiety. Well, at the root of those codependent relationships, remember codependency being a mutual dependency between individuals in a relationship. Both parties within the dynamic of the relationship are bringing in their own issues. They're bringing their own traumatic experiences. And at the root of the codependency, anyone who has experienced enmeshment, meaning entangled relationships in early childhood, have experienced any kind of abuse, psychological, verbal, emotional, physical, and or sexual abuse. Anyone who has experienced emotional or physical neglect, emotional or physical abandonment, that is the root issue, right? It's those traumatic experiences, those unhealthy behaviors we learned on how to formulate a relationship that then drives us into the need to depend on others for our self-worth, to be validated. And we depend on others to feel better about ourselves, to feel whole, to feel fulfilled. And at a very young age, again, while we initially, as young boys and girls, depend on mom and dad for that validation, many of us, because of these traumatic relationships and experiences that we've had, we continue into adulthood relying on people, places, and things to define our worth. With many of my clients that I work with, they struggle with autonomy. They struggle with knowing who they are because they've defined their worth. They've defined themselves by the role that they have. For instance, if I ask someone, who are you? Or who am I? The person will respond by saying, well, I'm a mother, I'm a father, I'm a daughter, I'm a caretaker, I'm a nurturer. And then my follow-up question would be, well, if I took those roles away from you, if you weren't a mother, if you weren't a father, right? If you weren't a caretaker, who are you? Who are you at your core? And that is a very, very difficult question for many people to understand. If any of you had the opportunity to listen to my first video, my first episode, where I provided my testimony, I talked about at the age of 31, where after having lost a husband, having lost my children, after losing my career, I got to a place in my life where I did not know who I was, because I had defined my worth and defined who I was by these roles that I had had. And now that I had lost them, I was just at a complete loss. I had lost myself. I did not know my identity. And quite frankly, at that point in my life, I just didn't believe that I had purpose. Unbeknownst to me, God had other plans. And I always say that, right? My higher power had plans for me that I didn't even know was in existence, or he was busy at work. So I share that with you to help you understand that because of my traumatic experiences as a child, and not knowing that I had had trauma at the time, not knowing on how to cope with my feelings that I had experienced, that I had had as a result of those traumatic experiences, it played a huge part in me believing that I needed people, places, and things to validate me, I needed to get that compliment. I needed to be acknowledged that I had done well. I needed to know that I was performing at my best, right? I believed that I had to rely on the world to make me whole. And I believed that for a really long time. So of course, I grew into being a people pleaser. I grew into being a rescuer. I grew into being a problem solver and being the fixer in everyone's life. Whether they asked me or not, over time, I just became that person, right? I became the person that was in the lead, the person who was in charge. Many would define that as controlling, right? I wanted to control everything and everyone around me. And interestingly enough, that was not on a conscious level. I didn't go in with this conscious intent to control anyone. At the end of the day, being transparent and being honest with you, I wanted to feel good about me. I wanted to know that I was a good person. I wanted to believe that, that I could be loved. And so maybe if I just, did a favor for someone, or if I could keep the peace, if I can just make everything go well and let everything go smoothly, right? If I can control the things around me, then that's going to validate me and I'm going to feel better about me. So that is something that many people that struggle with codependency struggle to understand, is that at the end of the day, we most oftentimes will blame the alcoholic, right? We'll blame the person that struggles with drugs and alcohol and say it's because of them that we're codependent. In reality, that's not the truth. My own personal experience with this is not about that because I was raised by, addicts. My mom and dad were not drug addicts and alcoholics by any stretch of the imagination. But in my years of therapy and in my years of experience, my mother is a rageaholic and my father and mother are codependent. Now, they were influenced by addicts in the generations before them. Now, because of culture and because of religious beliefs, this is not something that is spoken openly in my family, right? But through the years of hearing things, families talk, and you gather all of that information together. My mother was raised by alcoholics. And although she didn't use drugs and alcohol, the attitudes and behaviors of an alcoholic, actually, let me take alcoholic off the table because I don't like the stigma around it and I don't like the label behind it. Someone who's emotionally sick for whatever reason, because they don't have to be an alcoholic. They could be a womanizer, they can be a sexaholic, they could be a gambler, they can be so many different things. So let's look at it as being emotionally sick. My mother was raised by individuals that were emotionally sick, and so was my father. And this, remember, is never a blame game. So we're not going to go out into the world and we're not going to point fingers and say, well, you're the reason why I'm X, Y, and Z, right? But what we want to understand is hurt people hurt people. So if you were hurt by a loved one, right, and you were emotionally impacted by that loved one, there's a 99.9% chance that that individual was hurt as well. And what we're not learning is how to communicate effectively. What we are not learning is how to express ourselves, right? How to express how we're feeling. Again, culture, our religious beliefs, the generation in which many of us have come from, we've not learned that it's okay to feel. And that it's okay, for instance, to be angry. It's okay to be scared. Many of us grew up having feelings and not really knowing what to do with it. And that isn't just for us in this generation. It's for every generation that, that's before us that didn't know what to do with emotions. So as a result of that, we have these feelings that we experience and we hold on to them, right? Now let's go backwards a little bit and talk about, as a result of hurting people, we all come into this world and we are experiencing trauma. Trauma is any single event or ongoing event that creates emotional discord in an individual. It does not always have to be something that is catastrophic in someone's life. That trauma is dependent upon the individual, then and then that traumatic experience, how that, depending upon the age of the child, when the trauma happens, how that impacts the development of the brain. Brain development is so important in any of these discussions that I have with you, because when trauma happens, it stunts the development of the brain. The same way people talk of how when you use substances stunts the development of the brain. Well, guess what? Trauma does the exact same thing. So we can look at someone using substances at the age of 12 or 13, but if they had a trauma at the age of 3 or 4 years old, the brain's development slowed down. Didn't mean the brain wasn't developing, it just slowed down, and its maturation rate is a lot slower, way before they get into using mind and mood altering substances. And I want all my loyal listeners to hear this, and I pray that you pay this forward. I say it time and time again, drugs and alcohol is not the issue. Now, is using a substance could more, potentially kill you sooner than later? Absolutely, right? But you look at so many people that go to treatment, and people often ask, well, why is it that they relapse? Oh, it must be because they want to use again. No, it's not so much that they want to use again, right? Because going to treatment or going to get help and abstaining from mind and mood altering substances, that's not the issue. Any human being can do it, and many have proven to do it. It's coming back out into the world and discovering who you are, discovering your identity, discovering your authentic self, discovering purpose in a world that is so influential, right? We are stimulated and influenced in so many ways, right? Whether it's by cultural beliefs, whether it's by religious beliefs, whether it's by society beliefs. I mean, there's so many different things that's happening in and around us. And so it's about coming out into this world and trying to define who I am. Who am I outside of all of these things that's going on in the world? Now, this conversation that we're going to have today are for my believers. There are going to be people that may be listening to this podcast and you may not be a believer. You may not believe in a higher power, and that's okay, right? My podcast is designed to educate and to help us all understand that we are all perfectly imperfect, right? There is no perfect person that walks this earth. There just isn't one. And if there's a perfect person, I'd like to meet you, okay? But for me, I learned to discover my identity in what I believe to be true. And so for many years, I allowed the world and I allowed the temptations of this world and believing what the world had to say about me to be true. And unfortunately, what I believed about the world and how the world saw me, coupled with my trauma, I didn't think very highly of myself. I didn't believe in myself, right? And so that really increased my dependency issues. The more that I believed that I had to be perfect for others, the more that I believed that I had to be a particular way in order to be liked or to be loved or to be a part of, the more depressing that became, right? And it became a full-time job in having to learn on how to be something that really didn't align with my spirit at my core. So of course, that takes me through decades of using mind and mood altering substances. It takes me through, a time in my life where I was very self-destructive, harming myself and harming others without even realizing it. And a lot of times it was not intentional. And I need my listeners to understand that. Someone using mind and mood altering substances, and this is not an excuse, but they're not out to hurt you intentionally. Again, hurt people. It's almost like a knee-jerk response. Okay. Now, with that being said, as I began to get sober, I came to realize that for a lot of my life, a higher power, God as I understood him, was not part of the equation, right? Any and almost every decision made was based on what I wanted. It was based on the beliefs that I established as a result of how I was influenced by people, places, and things in the world. So coming into sobriety and going into Alcoholics Anonymous, which I always give so much praise to because it's been my saving grace, that is where I learned to discover who a higher power really was. And being able to have my own personal relationship with a higher power, and being able on that journey and through my 12 steps and really discovering who I truly am. And coupled with going to therapy and addressing my trauma issues, attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, having a sponsor and working my steps and getting honest with myself and really looking at all the parts of me that were, that I liked and the parts of me that I didn't like, and I had to own it, really took me in the direction of realizing how powerful God is and how great and almighty God has been in my life. As a result of my growing spiritually, it allowed me to discover my true identity was in who God created me to be, and not what the world or my parents or other people wanted me to be. And that's huge. And when you get there, it's life-changing. This opportunity and this reality of, I am who God created me to be. And who is that person? Well, it took some years. I didn't get that answer overnight. Like I said, in going to meetings and, learning more about my higher power as I understood him and going to therapy, I can say today that God has created a woman who is bold, who is courageous, who is beautiful, who is strong, and who's an overcomer, right? Now, you asked me that 13 years ago, I would have just been lost. I probably would have broken down and cried or ran away because I didn't have an answer. So my point to this is God created us to depend on him. He didn't create us to depend on others for the rest of our lives and or depend on, places and things, or depend on substances, or to depend on food, or to depend on people, or to depend on money. I mean, the list goes on when you think about the things that we depend on in this world to feel whole, to feel of worth, to feel validated, right? And it's really simple. My hat's off to all of those that are sick and suffering in one way, shape, or form, and make a decision to seek recovery of any kind, and to be able to seek a higher power, and to have that spiritual awakening and to pursue that spiritual relationship. Because when you discover your identity in God and what God has created you to be, sky is the limit. You develop this newfound spirit within yourself of knowing that you don't have to prove yourself to anybody. You don't have to perform a particular way to know who you are. You get to look in the mirror and identify and see that person and love that person for who they are, right? Without judgment. And the same way our higher power shows grace and mercy and forgiveness on us, we need to be able to look in the mirror and do the same thing. Now, in order to get there, right, to get to that place where we're codependent no more, there is some work that needs to happen. The first and foremost is that we need to admit that we have a problem. We need to admit that we depend upon people, places, and things, primarily individuals, to feel whole, to feel worthy, to feel validated, right? Once we can admit that, and we can admit that we are powerless over people, places, and things, that is the first step into stepping into our recovery and being able to take ownership, responsibility, and accountability for who we are and for the things that we've done, good, bad, and indifferent. I think it's very important that anyone that is seeking a recovery journey must show mercy and have grace on themselves. There's no purpose in judging yourself, and there's no purpose in judging others, right? Like I said, we are all perfectly imperfect. We all have flaws. And the sooner that we can embrace all parts of ourselves, right? The good, the bad, and the indifferent. And I hate to use the word good or bad. We're people, we're learning, we're living, right? But many of us have suffered trauma. And that trauma has really been that boulder and that barrier that has been in the way of us truly thriving in our lives. Many of us have been surviving and not really thriving and not really living. So I encourage you today that if you can identify with some of these characteristics that I've mentioned today, and you've realized that there is that you may be in a codependent relationship, or you have been in a codependent relationship, and you've not really done anything to treat your codependency, I encourage you to seek help today. I encourage you to go to a CODA meeting. It's called Codependency Anonymous. I encourage you to seek a counselor. If any one of you, after hearing this episode, would love to have a further conversation with myself and would love to do some private work with me, you're very welcome to give me a call. You can always reach me at www.collaborativehealingpartners.com. You can also find us on Instagram at Collaborative Healing Partners. You can email me, send me a private email at empoweredvoices45@gmail.com. Or continue listening. There are going to be many more episodes where we're going to touch more about codependency and how those trauma bonds that we create in those relationships really are very toxic to us and those relationships. And there are some people who learn to live in that type of relationship. And some people tend to settle and be satisfied with those unhealthy relationships, because to be quite honest, not everybody is ready to look in the mirror, and not everybody is really ready to own their truth, speak their truth, and acknowledge the parts of themselves that need improvement, and are really ready to live the life that God's called them to live. That's the truth. That's the reality, right? So this episode today is going to impact some of you. Many others are going to say, yeah, I'm codependent, but I'm okay with it, right? But I know that there's some of you out there that are in very unhealthy and toxic relationships, and trying to figure out, how do I get out of it? Or why does this keep happening to me? Why is it that every relationship that I get into, it just doesn't seem to work out? And we can't help but ask ourselves, what's wrong with me? And the reality is that nothing's wrong with anybody. It's about just understanding that you probably have some unresolved trauma that has shaped and influenced what you believe to be true. And if you believe that you're not worth it, if you believe you're not lovable, if you believe you're not capable, if you believe that you're not good enough, then you're not going to feel good about yourself. And as you venture out into the world, you're constantly going to be seeking the attention and the approval and the validation of others. And the problem with that is that when you're not receiving it from the world, then where are you receiving it from? And if God is not part of the equation for you, then more than likely you're going to feel lost, you're going to feel alone, you're going to feel empty, and that can lead to so many other things, right? It could lead to suicide. It can lead to depression, which can then lead to suicide. It can lead to depression, which can then lead to substance use, right? So the next time that you see someone struggling with addiction out there, primarily substance use and or alcohol, please understand that they have broken hearts, and they are people that are hurting, and they're human beings. They're no different than anyone else, and they just need a little bit of love and a little bit of understanding. In one of my next episodes, we're going to talk a little bit more about boundaries and why in codependent relationships we have a difficult time setting healthy boundaries. And whether we're in relationship with a loved one who is sick, we need to understand that if we're not setting boundaries and or following through on those boundaries, chances are that we are struggling emotionally as well. And before we can truly begin to heal relationships and or help or heal others, we must first be willing to look within ourselves and heal ourselves. Okay, so I hope this episode was truly helpful to you guys. I thank you so much for being loyal listeners and tuning in every week. I can't wait to talk more about this and to be able to talk more about boundaries and tell you a little bit more about my hula hoop and the importance of staying in your hula hoop. So stay tuned for that. There will be so much more to come. Again, you can check me out now on Instagram at Collaborative Healing Partners. You can email me at empoweredvoices45@gmail.com, or you can check out our website, collaborativehealingpartners.com. Thank you guys for tuning in and have a blessed day.